Hey everyone, welcome back to TechBit Academy. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into an absolutely transformative way to build better products, user-centered design, or UCD. If you've ever felt that awful tension between rapidly shipping features and getting actual user adoption, or if you're a builder trying to cross that massive gap between a working prototype and a product people literally love, well, you are in the right place. We're going to break down the core philosophy and the practical mechanics to make your development cycle actually focused on real empirical human behavior, because ultimately, that's what drives engagement and long-term retention. Let's get into it.
But before we get into the weeds, let me ask you a blunt question. Do you actually know who is using your product? Like, really know them? I know, it sounds super simple, but it's meant to challenge those standard assumptions we all make. Too often, really well-meaning teams get completely caught up in their own daily momentum. They end up building features for themselves, or they optimize for these completely hypothetical personas instead of looking at hard, empirical user data. And the result? You get this incredibly polished, highly functional product built perfectly for someone who, well, doesn't even exist. And you entirely miss the actual real people trying to navigate your interface.
All right, Section 1, Designing for the User. Let's shift our focus to the core philosophy here. So, what does UCD actually look like in practice? Simply put, user-centered design is the process of gaining a deep, continuous understanding of exactly who will be using your product throughout the entire design and development lifecycle. But here's the absolute most crucial thing to remember. True UCD is not just a rigid set of checkboxes. It's fundamentally a mindset. A lot of teams kind of confuse user-centered design with, just doing a single usability test at the very end of a sprint right before they deploy. But true UCD requires continuous contextual discovery. It's an approach driven entirely by an explicit, evolving understanding of your users, the specific friction points in their tasks, and the complex environments they actually operate in.
And this brilliantly illustrates how this mindset operates as a continuous loop. Look at how the steps feed right back into one another. We start by identifying a need, sure, but the process does not end when the code ships. We specify the context of use, detail the core requirements, build the design solutions, and then, this is key, we rigorously evaluate those designs against actual human behavior. Notice how identifying a need isn't just a one-and-done deal. The real magic, and honestly, sometimes the real friction, happens when an evaluation invalidates your initial requirements. If usability testing shows you completely missed the mark, well, you feed that harsh but super valuable data right back into the context phase. It's a repeating cycle that iterates, adapting to failure, until the system truly satisfies that initial market need.
Now, to make that iterative loop actually work at scale, you need a few essential ingredients. Let's fire through these. First, you absolutely must involve users throughout the entire process, from day one discovery all the way to post-launch refinement. Second, as we just established, it's a highly iterative approach. You're never really finished. Third, and this is massive for modern tech companies, it requires multidisciplinary skills and perspectives. You have to actively break down those old silos between engineering, product management, and design. Because when developers are separated from user pain points, empathy drops, and the cognitive load on the end user usually skyrockets. And finally, it addresses the whole user experience. Every single touchpoint, from the onboarding flow to the core features, has to feel totally cohesive.
Okay, let's dive into this next part. Section 2, the 4 UCD phases.
So the roadmap generally follows a pretty reliable, continuous rhythm. Specifying the context of use, clearly defining the requirements, creating the actual design solutions, and finally evaluating those designs. It's a highly structured framework that basically keeps teams from wandering off track. Let's pick up the pace a bit and unpack the deeper mechanics of what actually happens inside each one of these 4 phases.
Phase 1 is all about specifying the context. Listen, before you allocate a single hour of engineering time or build a single component, you have to deeply investigate who is using the product. Who exactly are these people? What's their precise purpose for engaging with your software? And crucially, and this gets overlooked all the time, under what environmental conditions are they operating? Think about it. Designing an interface for a chaotic, brightly lit, super high-stress hospital floor requires drastically different contrast ratios and target hit sizes than building an analytical dashboard for someone sitting in a quiet, dimly lit corporate office. Identifying the people, their purpose, and those specific physical and cognitive conditions, that sets the absolute foundation for the entire project.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Phase 2 introduces this fascinating tension, balancing business requirements with user goals. It's a necessary dual-track process. To really succeed long-term, your product has to explicitly identify and satisfy both sides of this equation. Yes, it has to be viable for the business. Maybe that means reducing operational costs, driving subscription revenue, increasing engagement metrics, whatever. But it absolutely must fulfill the distinct goals of the user. When these two are misaligned, things break down fast. For example, if you optimize purely for business KPIs, you can easily end up with dark patterns, manipulative interface designs that might give you a temporary bump in metrics, but literally destroy user trust and cause massive churn. Balancing both is what creates real sustainable value.
All right, once your context and requirements are firmly established, we hit phase 3, create design solutions. Now, this solution phase is purposefully done in stages, slowly evolving from a rough concept into a polished, complete design. You don't just jump straight to the finish line. In modern environments, this means moving systematically from low-fidelity wireframes up to high-fidelity interactive prototypes. You start rough, validate how the interaction models work early on, and then gradually refine the visual and functional design. Doing it in stages like this is absolutely critical because it dramatically saves development costs. It is exponentially cheaper to pivot a low-fidelity sketch based on user feedback than it is to refactor thousands of lines of production-ready code.
And that brings us to phase 4, evaluate designs. I want to slow down the pacing here for a second because this is arguably the most essential phase of the whole loop. It relies heavily on contextual usability testing with actual users. Think of it like this. This user evaluation is just as integral to the UCD process as quality assurance testing is to software development. Seriously, you would never dream of launching complex software architecture without rigorously testing it for bugs and edge cases, right? No way. Well, similarly, you should never launch a user interface without empirically testing it against real, totally unpredictable human behavior.
Moving right along to Section 3, adapting to your workflow. Let's move from the theoretical phases into practical execution in the real world.
So, I'll ask you directly, how does this actually fit into your timeline and your team? Honestly, this is frequently the most common pushback we see from lead developers and project managers. They inherently understand the value of user testing, sure, but they worry that implementing UCD is going to take way too much time, create blockers, or just completely disrupt their current momentum. The ultimate goal, however, is to figure out how this highly iterative cycle can actually be seamlessly integrated into your existing daily operations without derailing your quarterly deadlines. Let's move to and see how this builds in practice. The great thing here is that UCD is incredibly flexible. It's not a monolithic framework. It has tons of variation and can be seamlessly embedded into almost any workflow. It integrates into traditional, sequential waterfall approaches by establishing massive upfront research, but it also tightly integrates into fast-paced agile environments. For example, a lot of top-tier product teams use dual-track agile. This is where discovery, so your UCD research and prototyping, and delivery, the actual coding, happen on parallel, constantly interacting tracks. The research track stays one sprint ahead, constantly feeding validated concepts straight to the delivery track. It's molded entirely by what you're developing, and it completely adapts to your unique timeline and team requirements.
To conclude this explainer, I want to leave you with this pretty provocative thought. If you aren't evaluating with actual users, who are you really designing for? It's a powerful reality check for any product team. Without realizing it, you might just be inadvertently designing for yourself, or maybe for the aesthetic preferences of your designer, or just to appease some stakeholders' totally unverified assumptions. But if you want to build something truly impactful, the empirical data of the actual user absolutely must dictate your development process. Keep them in the loop, constantly test your assumptions, and let their real-world needs guide your solutions. Thanks so much for joining me today on this explainer.